This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 577 of the Late Round Podcast, so many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I know some of you are basketball fans, so I wanted to let you know that now that the 2021 NBA season is underway, so is FanDuel's free over-under contest. It's simple. Just head over to FanDuel.com/over-under and choose either over or under for each listed prop. You can make free picks for a chance to win a share of $5,000. All you have to do is make your picks on FanDuel before every NBA on TNT broadcast for your shot at a big payday. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. This is a 10 Trends show. Let's get to the trends. David Montgomery came back from injury on Monday night against the Steelers. In that game, he saw 76.5% of Chicago's running back rushes to go along with a 6.9% target share. Those numbers were below what he'd been seeing before his injury. But I think what was most surprising about Montgomery's performance was this. He had an 85.5% snap share. That was the highest of any running back in Week 9. So even though Khalil Herbert did see 4 rushes, and even though Montgomery's rush share was a little bit lower than normal, the snap share is something that makes me believe that Montgomery is a buy candidate right now after having a down matchup against a good defense. I thought they'd use Herbert more, and I was wrong. In that same Monday night game, Pat Freiermuth dominated. He was the tight end 1 on the week after scoring twice, and he's now averaged a target share per game of 20.1% over his last 3 games. In each of those games, he's finished as a top 10 weekly tight end. Over the last 2 weeks, Freiermuth is tied for second in the NFL in targets within the opponent's 10-yard line. I know Eric Ebron's been out, but I don't know how you don't just keep feeding Freiermuth at this point. He's a tight end 1 in fantasy football moving forward, which I know sounds really aggressive, but there just really aren't that many good options out there. And remember, all of this has coincided with Juju Smith-Schuster's season-ending injury. Over the last 3 weeks, Jalen Hurts has had a deep ball rate per game average of 37.4%. That means that over 37% of his passes have traveled 15 or more air yards. Let me give you some context to what that means. So far this season, the highest deep ball rate in the league is 24%. I'm going to talk about that more later. Jalen Hurts is at 37.4% over his last 3 games. Hurts has struggled this year as a passer, but for what it's worth, he's been above average at completing passes on those types of throws. Let's go back to that Monday night game and talk about Justin Fields. Fields finished the day with 18 fantasy points. He was the 10th ranked quarterback on the week. He's looked more and more comfortable throwing the ball over the last couple of weeks. And more importantly for fantasy, he's been running the ball more too. He's averaged almost 9 rush attempts per game over his last 3. He's averaged 62 rushing yards per game. In his 4 starts prior to that, he was averaging fewer than 4 rush attempts per game. And he was averaging 17 rushing yards per game. This is the Justin Fields I expected before the season started. He should be added off the waiver wire. They just have a bye this week, so I didn't mention him on the 15 Transaction show because I generally talk about streamers there. But Fields has some upside from here on out. Jerry Jeudy has now been back from injury for 2 games. In those 2 games, he's averaged a target share per contest of 24%. And that's being anchored a bit by last week's 32% target share performance. Courtland Sutton has suffered. I briefly talked about this on the 15 Transaction show yesterday, but Sutton has just 6 targets over his last 2 games. That's 3 per game. He was averaging over 9 targets per game without Jerry Jeudy. Now, I know there's a small sample size here. I'm not expecting 3 targets per game from Sutton from here on out. And that's part of the reason you can't really sell him right now. But I'm a little bit nervous about his week in, week out viability with Jerry Jeudy active. Aaron Jones has averaged a running back rush share per game of a little over 54% over his last 6. Across his first 3, that number was closer to 61%. And that includes a week 1 game where the Packers got destroyed by the Saints and they didn't use Jones that much at all. In weeks 2 and 3, Jones had closer to a 74% running back rush share. That's 20 percentage points higher than what he's seen since that point. This coincides with the team utilizing A.J. Dillon more. Since week 3, Dillon has averaged a running back rush share of 41.5% per game. And that coincides with the Packers throwing him on the field more. Weeks 1 through 3 saw Dillon never hit a 30% snap share. He's hit that in all but one game since. So how is this impacting Aaron Jones? Well, after week 3, he was the RB2 in fantasy football. Partially because of one monster game, but remember, he also had a weird performance in week 1 when the Packers got destroyed. Since week 3, he's averaging a little over 14 PPR points per game. And among players with 3 or more games played over this stretch, he's been the RB19 in points per game. We know that Jones has plenty of upside, and maybe the Packers utilize him more in November and December. It's hard to call him anything but a hold or a sell right now, though. Trend 7 is that Hunter Henry has now seen half of the Patriots' receiving touchdowns this year. That's the highest receiving touchdown share among all tight ends. The only player who's seen a higher percentage of his team's receiving touchdowns this season across the entire league is DK Metcalf. When looking at a yards to touchdowns conversion, Henry's outperformed touchdown expectation by 2.6 touchdowns. But he's seeing decent work in the red zone. And when you look at expected point formulas, it looks like Henry's only outperforming touchdown expectation by about 1 touchdown. So it's not as dramatic. The bigger problem, I would say, is just the share of touchdowns that he's seeing. It's going to be hard to maintain that type of usage. Darren Waller had his best game since week 1 and week 9. His target share was the highest it's been since that point in time, although it wasn't some outlier number. It was 23.9%. But that's a good sign that he saw a slight bump with Henry Ruggs out of the picture. And he produced, too. He saw double-digit targets for the first time since week 1, and he caught 7 of his 11 targets for 92 yards. That's the first time that Waller's exceeded 65 receiving yards since week 1. Hopefully this is a sign of things to come, because he's had a disappointing year after starting off so strong. Now, I talked about Jalen Hurts' rate of throwing at 15 or more air yards a little bit earlier. But here's one for you. I already said that the league leader has a 24% deep ball rate. Do you know who that player is? It's not Jalen Hurts, it's not Lamar Jackson, it's not Tom Brady, and it's not Russell Wilson. It's Baker Mayfield. I thought that was pretty interesting. And it's something that favors a player like Donovan Peoples-Jones having some usability at times if you're in a pinch. The last trend this week has to do with the Cincinnati Bengals pass catchers. They've had their trio of wide receivers together for all but 2 games this year. Those came in weeks 3 and 4. Tyler Boyd on the season has a 19.5% target share. That's been boosted a lot, though, by his target shares when T. Higgins wasn't active. In weeks 3 and 4, he had target shares of 33.3% and 34.4%. So without T. Higgins, he's had a target share per game of about 34%. With T. Higgins, that number drops to about 17%. Boyd has ranked higher than wide receiver 30 in weekly PPR scoring just twice this year. He's clearly been the odd man out with Jamar Chase in town. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. We got the Sleeper Show tomorrow. I'll talk to you then.